It's 5 a.m. and I am at the 10 Bells, a historic pub dating back to the time when this neighborhood was known as one of London's most crime-ridden areas. At 2 o'clock one fateful night, a woman named Annie Chapman walked through that door. She worked as a crochet knitter, but sometimes moonlighted as a prostitute. She came here looking for a client, hoping to earn some money. Witness accounts place her at this pub between 5 and 5:30 in the morning, dead drunk. At 6 a.m., her mutilated body was found some 20 minutes from here. Jack the Ripper had quickly become Britain's most notorious serial killer, not least because he was never caught. Today, we'll sieve through all available data and try and figure out who he was and why he did it. This is Lyadov, and my today's episode is dedicated to the most mysterious of serial murderers, Jack the Ripper. Today, we're traveling both in space and time, to Whitechapel in the East End of London circa August 1888. Back then, there was absolutely nothing here. No asphalt, no electric lights, it was very dark and quiet. Imagine this, late at night, a man and woman walked into an alley like this. They made their way through a doorway into a pitch-dark house, where she got stabbed 39 times on a landing above the first flight of stairs. She was stabbed multiple times in the throat, in the heart, in the lungs, in the stomach, and even in the genitals. A witness said that someone had shouted murder, but not a single person dared check it out. The body lay in a pool of blood for hours before it was discovered and eventually identified as a 39-year-old prostitute, Martha Tabram. She had been seen in a pub with a client until about midnight, then leaving for the house where she was renting a room. It still remains a mystery why she was killed and what exactly led to it. 39 stab wounds, and the murderer was never caught. Martha Tabram's was one of the first cases ascribed to Jack the Ripper. However, this murder is not one of the canonical 5. Later, the experts agreed that despite exceptional cruelty, it did not match Jack the Ripper's MO. It is quite possible that several killers were operating in Whitechapel around the same time. There were so many crimes in the area that the police simply did not have the resources to handle all of them. Many cases were often closed because they simply did not know what to do. Whitechapel is also known for an endless number of little alleys and back streets. It's like a maze here. I mean, really. All I've been doing is taking turns walking from one dark alley into another. And look, all of them are dark and empty. It's very quiet here because the alleys are narrow and there are so many buildings that all the traffic sounds get muffled by the walls. and you end up in an atmosphere that feels perfect for a serial killer prowling these alleys in search of victims and stalking them. Retracing the killer's steps really gives you chills when you imagine how cold-blooded and confident he must have felt, having studied the local maze of alleys to absolute perfection. And thinking about the victims, you begin to feel how they must have felt too. When the killer pursued the victim, at some point she'd realize she was being followed and got nervous. She would probably start walking faster, maybe even run, but there's no escape from this maze. Driven by panic, the victim would start making turns, turning into one alley after another. That's how it was. Michael Priestley is a native Londoner. He lives not far from Whitechapel and has dedicated most of his life to researching Jack the Ripper's case. He even wrote a book about his murders. You can see him carrying it right now.
Hello, Mick.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So this is the place where the first murder happened.
Whitechapel was seen as poor as it got, and there were certain streets in Whitechapel that were essentially large homeless communities working.
So it was ghetto?
It was very much a ghetto. It was a slum. The buildings were often unsanitary, unsafe, unfit to be lived in, with rats and mice and fleas, cockroaches, anything you can imagine. Entire families packed into one horrible, squalid room. And if that was you, it was up to you, any way you possibly could, to find the money to feed yourself, to put your head down for the night. You typically didn't own a house or own your own flat to live in. You would rent a horrible room that was unsafe. You would pay night by night to stay in a lodging house, which is basically a homeless shelter, where you would be packed into a room alongside any number of strangers. The food would be very basic and minimal. People were starving to death. Sanitary conditions were terrible. Destitution, poverty, crime were rife and commonplace. It was a very miserable place and a miserable time to be alive if you were living in Whitechapel in the late Victorian.
London experienced a large inflow of immigrants in the second half of the 19th century. A lot of people were migrating from Ireland, settling in mostly large cities, and the East End of London became as a community where immigrants soon outnumbered the native population. There wasn't enough work for everyone, and immigrants were paid mere pennies, and that was if they got paid at all, because they were often simply cheated. Drunken brawls, robberies, murders, prostitution, and poverty, such was Whitechapel in the late 19th century.
Was it dangerous in Whitechapel then?
It was. It was seen as a very dangerous place to live. Certain streets were seen as worse than others. So during the day, times were hard, particularly at night time. It was a dangerous place to be. There were things like knife crime is not a new thing. Violent gangs roaming the street is not a new thing. It was poverty-driven crime. You regularly read reports in the old Victorian newspapers of mugging, stabbings, thefts, break-ins, all of the sort of things that you hear of today that people are driven to do by having nothing. Was all taking place regularly in the East End. People were desperate, and you'd be surprised what people are prepared to do if they need the money bad enough.
People were angry and violent because there were no jobs. Unemployment was on the rise. For many women, prostitution became almost the only way to earn any money. By October 1888, London already had 62 brothels and around 1,200 prostitutes. Almost all of them were immigrants who lived in the impoverished areas, including Whitechapel. In other words, they lived in places where it was extremely easy to get away with just about anything because the police did their best to avoid them. those areas didn't know the proper rule of law. There was no CCTV and potential witnesses were too scared for their lives. If someone was being attacked and shouted, "Murder! Help!" no one would even look out because they knew they might be next. Three weeks after Martha Tabram's murder, another body was found in the district. At 3:40 a.m. on August 31, 1888, a delivery man named Charles Allen Cross was making his way to work through Whitechapel when he noticed a large covered object on the street. It was still dark, and it became apparent that it was a body lying in a pool of blood only after the sunrise, when the police finally arrived. The victim was identified as Mary Ann Nichols. She was a middle-aged woman of 40 years old who often prostituted herself. On the night in question, she did not have the 4 pence she needed to pay for her lodging and was last seen on the streets, where she ended up being the first known canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. Her throat was cut and her abdomen was ripped open.
10 feet exactly here. This used to be a stables yard standing right here where we are. And she was found lying on the path here with her head pointing that way, her feet pointing this way. And she was found at 3:40 that morning by a man named Charles Cross as he made his way to work. He was walking on this side of the street behind me. And he said, looking across the street in the dark, he saw what he thought was a rolled up sheet or an old carpet or something like that. And on crossing over the road, found that it was a woman lying here in front of the stables yard.
What happened next?
It was a man called Robert Paul came walking up the street behind him in the dark. He heard him coming. He turned around and he said, "Hey, look, there's a woman lying here on the floor." Robert Paul came across to join him, and they found that she was lying on her back with her head turned to the right. Her clothes were pulled all the way up chest high, and her legs were wide apart with both hands by her sides. They pulled her clothes back down. And then they failed to notice in the darkness that her throat had been cut. The blood had actually flowed from her neck underneath her back with the way the path was sloping and was soaking into the back of her clothes. They pulled her clothes down, couldn't decide if she was dead or not. Robert Paul said, "Let's just leave the scene. We'll leave. I need to get to work. If we see a policeman on the way, we'll let him know." So they made the way to the end of Valence Road, which is only at the end of the street here. It used to be called Baker's Row.
The two men informed the first police constable they came across about the body they had found, and he, in turn, called it in and started the investigation.
When the police turned up, the first thing they did, it was a dirt track, this road at the time, and they checked for wheel marks in the road. There were no wheel marks. That whoever committed the murder would seem to have arrived at the scene on foot and then fled on foot afterwards. Directly just right next to us here is the train station. They actually they thought for a while maybe he jumped across the bridge and escaped along the train lines, but he hadn't. The police turned up, did door-to-door inquiries. Nobody'd seen anything, nobody'd heard anything, and the case quickly went cold after that.
Is there any understanding about like why would he do this exactly to this lady, or it was just someone on the street? Like,
well, in a modern case, they would say he's sexually motivated, and it's like as the case will go on, you would notice that all of the victims are roughly about the same height, about the same age. They're all dressed in black at the time they were killed. In a modern case, they would say he's got a murder fantasy he has in his head that he likes to act out. He meets his victims randomly in the street by chance, but he waits until somebody fitting that description comes along to commit the murder and to do the mutilations and things that he did. He finds it very arousing to do that. So he's a sexually motivated serial killer. He does the deed, he runs, and then he will relive it in his own time, and then eventually he will pop up again.
Did he rape her?
He did not. They used to call that connection with an X in the old Victorian newspaper reports. CONNEXION was like a rape or a sexual assault. And all of the autopsy reports always said there was no sign of recent connection. But the victims were always found posed in a sexual kind of manner with the legs apart and the clothes pulled chest high. All of the parts that he stabbed and mutilated are all parts he might find arousing in between the thighs, the groin, up across the chest.
press took covering this story to a whole new level. The newspapers presented every gory detail about the mutilations sustained by the victims and were full of descriptions like this. The throat had been cut from left to right so deeply, the vertebral bones bore striations. The instrument used at the throat and abdomen was the same. It must have been a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade. Her throat wounds had been inflicted from left to right. One of these two wounds measured 8 inches and the other 4 inches in length. Both reached back to her vertebral column. Her abdomen had been mutilated with one deep, jagged wound, 2 or 3 inches from the left side. The Star published multiple articles about the murders and even put forward its own assumptions about the killer. Naturally, this fueled panic. He has ranged Whitechapel for a long time. He exercises over the unfortunates who ply the trade after 12 o'clock at night. He has kicked, injured, bruised, and terrified 100 of them, and each of the dead bodies represents that threat carried out. So the press was whipping up panic, and people started to fear leaving their homes even more than before. They waited for new reports every day in anticipation of more murders. At the same time, the press was very critical of the police, picturing it as guilty of concealing information and inaction. Naturally, after such coverage, the public was gripped by a frenzy, all of which played right into Jack the Ripper's hands. And I'm 100% convinced that the killer read all of these newspapers, and he definitely enjoyed it. Because what's not to like? He's killing people and now everyone is talking about him. He's famous, a psychopath's dream come true. Nevertheless, amid this panic, the police did everything they could. After each murder, they collected all witness accounts and detained everyone matching the descriptions. They tried hard to find any leads, but it was all in vain. We are now at the East London Cemetery and Crematorium. It is the resting place of Jack the Ripper's third victim, Elizabeth Stride. She was killed at the age of 44 and also engaged in occasional prostitution. In fact, it is remarkable that her grave has been preserved because, as you understand, poor women of this profession were not exactly mourned by the public. Besides, she had no relatives in England. But today, everything is different. If you look at the other graves, you'll see that, this is the most remote part of the cemetery and most graves are practically abandoned. You can see that no one has visited them for a very long time. Perhaps because there are no surviving relatives. Only the old disintegrating tombstones and the grass. No flowers, nothing. And now look at Elizabeth Stride's grave. Here it is. This is what it looks like. Someone planted flowers here, and they are in bloom now. There are also artificial flowers on the grave. You can see that the gravestone is cared for. It looks pretty, and there is a figure of an angel. Honestly, it feels a bit eerie, seeing a grave of someone who died in 1888. It also makes you realize that all of those stories about Jack the Ripper are not just urban legends. It was actual and real. Here is buried his victim, a woman who was 44 years old. We know that she came to London from Sweden. She worked as a domestic servant, a waitress, and occasionally took clients as a prostitute, because she was in need. It is known that back in Sweden, she became pregnant, but her child was stillborn. She was only 22 at the time. In order to somehow fix her life, to start everything from a clean slate, she moved to England and tried to build a new life in London. At first, it seemed like she managed to turn it around. She got married. It was a good match because she married a ship's carpenter, which was generally considered quite good. The couple even ran a coffee shop. In general, one could say they lived well. But at some point, they had to part ways. They separated, and in the end, Elizabeth had to make money by prostituting herself. So just imagine, after a hard life like this, she ended up brutally killed. On September 30th, 1888, she was found with her throat slit in a yard on Berners Street in Whitechapel. The cut to the throat was deep, and blood was still flowing from it when the body was found, according to the eyewitness accounts. If one can say so, Elizabeth was luckier than all the other victims because there were no further mutilations besides the slit throat and a severed earlobe. The latter would later prove important for the investigation. You know what? Elizabeth Stride was seen alive by a witness, one James Brown. As he passed by, he recognized Elizabeth Stride, who was talking most likely to her killer at that very moment. These were exactly the kind of leads the police needed.
I think that when James Brown has walked past here at 12:45 and seen her, telling the man, no, not tonight, maybe some other night, he's attempting to get to go with him, he's offering her money or something like that. She said, no, not tonight, not interested. I think, in my opinion, she's possibly left him there, walked around this corner to leave the scene. He's followed her around the corner, maybe thinking she's going to work out who I am, it's all going wrong. His fantasy isn't planning out like he thought it was going to. I think he's dragged her into that yard there, just as it was the nearest convenient dark spot, done the deed really quickly, posed up the body, which would be the most important bit to him, these signature factors at the crime scene, then being very unhappy with the crime scene and taken off running.
The very same night, literally hours later, another dead prostitute was found in another neighborhood in the city of London. You can see London's famous Gherkin building from right here. Her body was found right here, on this very corner, mutilated almost beyond recognition. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. She is considered to be Jack the Ripper's fourth canonical victim, and in her case, there were witnesses. 3 men who had just come out of a pub saw Eddowes talking to a man. They even managed to get a closer look at him. He was white, about 60 years old, wearing a small white mustache, a jacket with a red scarf around his neck, and a peaked cap. Obtaining his description was quite a breakthrough both for the police back then and for our investigation. All on-screen portrayals of Jack the Ripper show him wearing a long coat and a Victorian top hat, which was typical attire at the same time. However, it was not atypical for an impoverished neighborhood. A top hat and a long coat were not cheap clothes. They would have been out of place in a ghetto where no one could afford to dress like that. But a cap and a jacket is quite a different description, actually fitting of the areas like Whitechapel.
She'd been heavily mutilated in this crime scene. It was the most graphically violent of the murders so far. She was found lying on her back with her head in the corner to the left from where we're standing. Her legs were wide apart. Like Mary Ann Nichols, she had both hands lying by her sides. Her clothes were pulled up chest high, leaving her naked from the chest down. Her intestines had actually been pulled from inside her, and according to the police report, had been stuffed into a throat wound. A 2.5-foot section of her colon had been removed from inside her, placed on the ground in between the left arm and the body. Her face had been heavily mutilated with a number of stab and slash injuries. Her left kidney and her entire womb were missing from the crime scene, and along with almost half of a white apron she was wearing, the killer would appear to have taken them with him from the crime scene.
Once the bodies of Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride were identified, the police began working in the area. Before long, a terrifying discovery was made on a nearby street. A blood-soaked fragment of the apron worn by the murdered Eddowes, left presumably by the murderer, hanging on a brick wall.
So, what is this place?
This is the doorway of 108 to 119 Wentworth dwellings here on Dorset Street, and it's here that the missing part of Catherine Eddowes' apron, torn from her at the crime scene in Mitre Square, would be found. Now,
thousands of letters had been arriving to the police every day. Then, suddenly, among this flood of mail, a few stood out, allegedly written by the killer himself. The police started examining them in search of any useful clues. The nickname Jack the Ripper actually first appeared in one of these letters written from the perspective of the murderer himself. The overall motivation of the author was to mock the investigation. Here's a short quote from the first letter. I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. At first, the letter was regarded to be a hoax, the kind the police cannot afford to waste time on. But the author of the letter evidently knew it, because he continued to write the following. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for giggles. A day later, the police found that Elizabeth Stride's earlobe was indeed cut off. This meant the letter could have really been written by the murderer. A few days later, the police received a postcard, written by the same hand, also in red ink. Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I got a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. Then the author thanked the detectives in a postcard. I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter. Back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper. Now let's take another look at these pages. The handwriting is just immaculate. Essentially, it's not just a letter, but an exercise in calligraphy. It's safe to assume that hardly any of the poor Whitechapel folk could write like that. And why the red ink? Why write letters at all? But since we have the sample of the man's handwriting, we can learn some things about him from a graphologist. Graphologists are experts who can make conclusions about a person's character and even mental deviations based on their handwriting. Inessa Goldberg is a graphologist who studied Jack the Ripper's letters. It is her opinion that when a person writes with such precision that the writing resembles a work of art, there's ground for suspicion. Sometimes beautiful handwriting works like a mask covering up some unpleasant reality a person is hiding.
I find that Jack the Ripper's handwriting is indicative of a very specific mental condition. It's not a mental illness. It is a mental disorder known as the obsessive-compulsive disorder. In simple terms, it refers to a person's obsessiveness, preoccupation. It means that a person keeps obsessing about some ideas or fears. Such people are known to develop rituals and repetitive actions in order to ease their anxiety.
As far as Jack the Ripper is concerned, it's already quite obvious that he had a macabre ritual, where he'd start by slitting the victim's throat before ripping up the body. But you know what? There are things that seemed even scarier to me.
You see, the way this works is that such people can be completely normal in everyday life interacting with society. It could be a completely unremarkable person who neither stands out nor draws any particular attention.
Either way, this profile fully matches Russian serial killer Chikatilo. It's quite possible, for example, that Jack the Ripper, too, also had a family and children who suspected nothing.
We describe him like as a person. Was it just a crazy guy, or was it self-concentrated? Or
well, if you'd met him, like with a lot of other serial killers, he clearly seems to be able to act normal. The police believed he would be a local man from this immediate area. They think he would sit drinking in the local pubs. Then, when he gets kicked out at 12:30, 1 in the morning, which was closing time, and he's got a buzz going, he would take to the streets and walk around the back streets. If he doesn't see an opportunity, he's not so crazy that he's going to risk himself getting caught. He's sensible enough to not push it. He'll go home. He doesn't fancy his death penalty. He doesn't want to get arrested. All sorts of people will have met him, spoken to him, known him, lived next to him, and thought nothing of him. But he does have a compulsion in his head that he fantasizes about constantly, a sexual compulsion, like Ted Bundy or Peter Sutcliffe or Richard Ramirez or any of these type of guys. So he's quite capable of acting like a normal guy. He might be legally sane and sensible, but he has a compulsion that drives him to do these kind of things. He feels the need to act out these kinds of offenses.
Handwriting is also a significant factor in the process of communication. If the handwriting is illegible, then no one will understand you. There are some mentally ill people who write in such a way that no one can make out anything. How does that work?
Handwriting fails to accomplish its mission when it becomes illegible. So why write then? The experts have observed that people who protest or stage provocations often have illegible handwriting. Illegibility in such cases is a manifestation of their desire to violate social boundaries and disrupt social norms. But when we look at serial killers, we can observe that many of them have neat and perfectly legible handwriting, and that's indicative of their methodical nature and predisposition to calculation. These are, as a rule, deeply traumatized people. That certainly doesn't justify them, but can give us an insight into their development. These individuals are usually terribly afraid of being rejected, of being pushed back, of being suspected of something, and, God forbid, turned away, because that's their deepest pain. They crave social acceptance.
Sad as it was, graphology was not part of the criminal investigation toolbox at the time, and the only thing the police could think of was that someone might actually recognize the handwriting of their colleague or neighbor. Additionally, forensic experts noted that the murderer handled his victims very skillfully. He knew how to slit a throat to cause instant death and avoid blood splatter. He knew how to remove internal organs, keeping them intact. This led to suggestions that he had some medical expertise, possibly even as a surgeon. But most Jack the Ripper investigators disagree with this very theory.
Do you think you have a medical education for doing all this stuff?
No. Whenever you watch the movies or the documentaries, they make out like he was medically trained. The police at the time say he didn't even display, they said not even the skill of a butcher or a horse slaughterer. They said anybody could have done it. They said it had to be a man with a strong knife, with a strong handle. The blade doesn't seem to give way as he's doing these things. They said he had no design on any particular organ. He would just, as violently and as quickly as he could, he would inflict his mutilations. If he does grab something from the crime scene, like from the body and remove it from the crime scene, he didn't know what it was either. Said absolutely anybody could have done it. The idea that he was some sort of medically trained doctor is a modern thing. In the movies, out comes the scalpel from the doctor's bag. Nobody said that at the time. Anybody could have done it. And yeah, they believe it was a regular man living somewhere in this area with a knife, no medical training whatsoever.
2 weeks after the double murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, a box arrived by post addressed to George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. The contents were truly horrifying. Half a preserved human kidney. Just imagine how bold and untouchable the killer felt, sending a victim's kidney to his own investigators, along with a letter that became the most famous of all. It was signed, "From Hell." From Hell, Mr. Lusk. Sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman and preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, only if you wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk. A conclusion can be made that Jack the Ripper was not interested in watching a person suffer. This distinguishes him from many other serial killers. It seems that it was important for him to kill in a matter of seconds, so that the victim didn't even have time to make a sound. Moreover, if you look at the victims' bodies, you'll notice many similarities that together constitute the killer's MO.
Is that the victims are all found on the back with the head to the side, their eyes open, with the exception of Mary Ann Nichols and Catherine Eddowes, one hand across the chest, objects arranged around them. He would remove their hats from the heads and place them on the ground behind them, legs apart, clothes pulled up. They didn't fall like this, you see, that he commits the murder, then he poses you up in this way. And the reason he does this is he has a very well-rehearsed fantasy in his head that he's attempting to act out at the crime scene. So if you had two murderers in the same area,
But what happened on November the 9th was simply unprecedented in scale and cruelty. Prostitute Mary Jane Kelly became the last and fifth canonical victim of Jack the Ripper. She was only 25 years old, and unlike his previous victims, she was killed in a private room she rented. She was found in her own bed, and what had been done to her shocked everyone who saw it.
There was police arriving on the scene. Police Inspector Edmund Reed Police Inspector Walter Dew, who arrived at the scene. When he wrote his memoirs, much later as an older man, he said that in 30, 40 years in the police, that was the worst thing he'd ever seen.
The mutilation of Kelly's body was by far the most extensive. First, the killer slit her throat, then removed almost all her internal organs, and imagine this, arranged them around her. A photograph from the crime scene survives, and it's not for the faint of heart. As per YouTube's rules, we can't even show that photograph to you.
Even with modern-day serial killers, there are few crime scenes that showed a higher level of violence than the murder of Mary Kelly in that room at Miller's Court. The killer, it was believed, had spent some 2 hours at the crime scene. Then, when he'd gone to leave, had managed to jam the door shut. There was a problem with the lock. He seemed to have broken the spring in the lock somehow when closing it. The police believed he'd actually slid up one of the windows, climbed out into the square, slid the window back down behind him, and then had made his escape.
Soon the police finally managed to get on the trail of a certain Francis Tumblety. He did not match the witness descriptions. He was 55 at the time, and you certainly couldn't call him burly. He also had a big mustache that would definitely have caught any witness's eye. But his activity provided grounds for an arrest. Francis posed as a gynecologist who performed illegal abortions, and on top of that, he was known as a misogynist. Before moving to London, he lived in the United States with his wife, and at some point learned that she was working as a prostitute. Tumblety decided to move from America to London. He immediately got on the police radar. He was arrested for harassment of people on the streets, but no actual evidence was found against Tumblety on the murder case. After a 3-day-long detention, he was released on bail and returned to the US.
He seemed to be somebody who lived in this area, in the poor area, in the slums. He must surely live by himself or his own room perhaps, because there's nobody to think he's suspicious when he keeps getting home late at night, in the middle of the night when the murders took place. But from the descriptions that were given of him, including the description given here, he was never considered a serious suspect at the time. But if you were to Google Jack the Ripper suspects, Francis Tumblety is always one of the names that appears.
All right.
Be that as it may, there is one more piece of indirect evidence against Tumblety. Soon after his return from London to New York, the latter was shocked by a series of brutal murders of prostitutes. Just like in London, the police discovered seriously mutilated bodies. But again, there was no evidence against Tumblety. We know that he went on to live until eventually dying in 1903. Whether he was the infamous Jack the Ripper, we will probably never know. This cold case continues to fascinate even the great-grandchildren of those who originally investigated it. Recently, for example, Sarah Bax Horton, the great-great-granddaughter of one of the officers on the case, published her own investigation. She managed to find new leads in the old police notes. Judging by the nature of the injuries and the victims, I believe the suspect may have been a patient in one of the city's psychiatric hospitals. This lead is worth checking out. Sarah went through the paperwork for all the psychiatric patients and found a cigar maker, Chaim Hyams. His whereabouts place him right in the middle of the area where the murders took place. He fit the murderer's profile both physically and in terms of his medical history. He was 35 years old and had a history of epilepsy and alcoholism. He was prone to having fits, after which he became violent, and the frequency of his fits matched the timing of his murders. Even his gait matched the description supplied by the witnesses believing to have seen the killer. After carefully studying and cross cross-checking the facts, Sarah Bax Horton concluded that the insane Mr. Himes was Jack the Ripper. Even the violent MO could have been his, but with the previous suspect, Tumblety, it was clear why the murder stopped. He was arrested and left the country. Around the same time, Himes was also taken into custody for offensive behavior. After that, he was sent to an asylum, where he stayed until his death. The theory with Tumblety, who fled to the States and might have continued killing there, seems to me more plausible. But all in all, it appears that we'll never know for sure who Jack the Ripper really was.
In my opinion, Jack the Ripper was a man named Albert Backett. B-A-C-H-E-R-T. Nobody's ever suggested him before. His parents were German. He was born and raised in Whitechapel. He was living by himself in the middle of the murder zone at the time the offences were all committed. He's the right age, he fits the right description. He's got a criminal record for all of the things you'd expect a serial killer to have today. He was constantly injecting himself into the investigation. He told the police that he'd met the killer and spoken to him twice. He said that the killer was writing letters to his house to threaten him and warn him of murders. He said the killer was writing graffiti on the wall of his house, but it was magically washed away before anybody could see it. He worked as well as an engraver, engraving copper plates for banknote printing, or if you want your name on your watch, he's your guy. The reason that's interesting, there were 4 women in the area who all got attacked but got away. Like Ted Bundy has a few survivors, so does Jack the Ripper if you go digging through the archives. And all of these women said they'd been conned by a man who had convinced them to go with him after conning them with fake coins. These coins, it was said, had been polished extremely brightly to look like gold coins when they weren't, and then crimped and machined around the edges, it was said, to appear like very valuable half sovereign or half crowns. Albert Backett, as a professional engraver, would have had all of the tools and the knowledge to do that in the house if he'd wanted to. Not many people would have. Then in 1889, he was actually taken to court and charged on 2 separate counts for passing counterfeit coins exactly like that in a bunch of pubs through East London. I think if this case was happening today, Albert Backett is absolutely the #1 person that the police would want to go and speak to.
By now, Jack the Ripper's story has become an old classic horror tale. The streets of London are full of tourists. There are pubs, fish and chips places, and restaurants named Jack the Ripper, with lots of people walking around. Luckily for us, I think there's no chance that something like that could have gone unpunished today.